Hola.
Good afternoon. My name is Silvia Arroyo. I'm the coordinator of activities in Fundación Telefónica. Welcome to the cycle Tech&Society that we have in cooperation with the Aspen Institute in Spain. This type of events gather experts to debate about the transformation, the digital transformation and the way it's affecting our lives. We've been having this cycle for 3 years, and to name a few examples of the topics that we've been dealing with, we've been talking about the need of creating ethical guidelines in artificial intelligence. We've talked about how to create a safe and secure use of the digital by our children, and also we've been talking about the way this digital transformation is affecting arts and the culture in general. We have today Heli Tiirmaa-Klaar. She is the special ambassador of Cyberdiplomacy from Estonia in the Public Affairs Ministry from Estonia, about her career and our molto career. My colleague will tell you in a moment. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here with us in the Tech&Society, the role of cyber technologies in the digital technologies. And I would like to thank the ambassador, and I would like also to thank the Fundación Telefónica to cooperate with us in the Tech&Society program. This is a very important program for us because it's very much connected to the birth of the Aspen Institute in the United States. This institute comes about at a time where the technological advances and its consequences was not going hand in hand. After the development of the atomic bomb, we were looking for a crisis that was affecting the Western countries. The Aspen Institute tries to balance the tensions between these two phenomena, what we need to do and what we can do as a society in the search of the global well-being. And it's a pleasure for us to have Heli Tiirmaa-Klaar today to talk about cyber diplomacy and the growing interconnection at a global level in an environment of the growth of telecommunications and digital connections, and how to promote safety in the cyberspace. Heli Tiirmaa-Klaar is the special ambassador of the Cyberdiplomacy in the Ministry of Public Affairs in Estonia. She also was in charge of the coordination of cyber policies for the external European External Action Service, where she managed the relationships, external relationships in cyber affairs from 2012. She started working on cybersecurity in 2007, and Andrea Aurea Molto is the sub-director of external policy, and she is the director of politicaexterior.com. She has also been a counselor for the Secretary of State of Global Spain for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the European Union and Cooperation. So I'll leave the floor to them now.
I do it in English if you allow me, but I guess that you will all speak English, and there is no problem with understanding, and you possibly have been provided with these blue things that I have been provided with, that is translating. Thank you for introduction, and thank you for a generous offer by Aspen Institute and Telefónica Foundation to invite me here to Madrid. The city where I always find fascinating people, good food and sunshine. So it's nice to be in Madrid again. I'll say a few words about cyber diplomacy and what we do, cyber diplomats. It's a new breed of officials or diplomats that has emerged recently. And I'm just trying to explain our mission and our challenges, and then we will have interview style questions and answers later on. The cyber diplomats actually are dealing with the same issues as the normal diplomats, meaning the state behavior and how we regulate the state behavior and how we are calling the states to behave properly in cyberspace. Because as we know, the states are doing interesting activities in cyberspace that they wouldn't do in regular space. And this is the question how we are calling for more responsible state behavior also in cyberspace, and how we are implementing all these norms and confidence building measures in cyberspace, and how we make sure that international law is held up in cyberspace. In short, the state behavior is our focus. Of course, cyberspace, as we know it, is also multi-stakeholder domain, and it's made up of all different technological and other devices where mostly private sector produces this domain and private sector runs the domain. So we cannot just talk about states being involved there, but we also have to keep in mind that it's a multi-stakeholder format where we are, or multi-stakeholder domain where we are operating. So, and therefore, one very important part of our activity is also to talk with all the stakeholders, with the private sector and civil society, especially in the context of the internet governance and internet freedom, because as the multi-stakeholder model of the internet governance, which has brought us this interoperable global and free internet, should be maintained. And the maintenance of this global interoperable internet that is accessible is not given. There are voices calling for very different internet governance model. There are voices which would like to have internet as it is run by the governments, by multilateral systems, by multilateral organizations. And this is what we, the democratic nations, do not support. We think in order to preserve the interoperable and global internet where freedom of expression is allowed and certain technological layer is provided by the technology organizations which allows us to operate globally, this is what we strive for. So this was the second concentration of our activities. And the third concentration of our activities would be to help those countries who are still learning how to become digital and how to protect themselves against cyber threats. So capacity building in third countries, capacity building in terms of expertise, infrastructure, knowledge is very important part of cyber diplomacy because as we know, even in our technologically advanced countries, we do not have enough experts. And often the private sector, the public sector, wherever you look, they are complaining about not having enough experts available on cybersecurity. So if we have shortage, then the shortage is much bigger outside of our more technologically advanced world. When I was in the European Union, we set up very serious cyber assistance programs for countries that are the European Union partners on development cooperation. When we talk about cyber diplomacy, we always also think about the notion of what actually the citizens and what the individuals and what the society at large is thinking about the government involvement in this space. And I think we need to also show that the governments that are sometimes accused to be too passive and not taking steps quickly enough and not reacting quickly enough to all different problems in cyber issues are actually already there, and they are doing many things. Just an example, for the last 10 years, the diplomats have been discussing the norms for responsible state behavior in the United Nations. We have the 3 reports which are based on consensus views within the United Nations setting the norms of responsible state behavior. These groups are called groups of governmental experts. In 2010, 2013 and 2015, these groups have agreed on reports which are listing the norms for responsible state behavior and also clearly articulating that the existing international law applies in cyberspace. What the governments also have been achieving is quite a good policy posture in major international organizations, in NATO, in the European Union, in OSCE, in ASEAN Regional Forum, in Organization of American States, and so on. So basically what possibly we also would appreciate to see more is the multi-stakeholder outreach, and that's why, as many of you know, the French government has launched an initiative which is called the Paris Call, which is bringing together the private sector, the civil society and the governments for the same topic. So all these initiatives are quite welcome, and I think this is the way to go in order to secure our cyberspace and make sure that we will be able to operate this global interoperable space also in the future. I think we will have a long evening ahead of us, and I see some familiar faces from my Brussels time. Hello, Alejandro. And so we will have the next session now with the questions. So.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. Telefónica for hosting this event. Thanks, Aspen. Thanks, Ambassador Heli. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening to share this conversation with one of the world's leaders on cybersecurity. Today, there's no government in the world, nor any international organization which does not have the cybersecurity at the top of the political agenda. And we are lucky to talk about this topic with Ambassador Tiirmaa-Klaar, because she comes from a country, Estonia, which has become a world reference in the digitalization of the state and also in cybersecurity. Ambassador, I'm personally interested in starting this conversation with the cyber attack that your country suffered in 2007. Because it was one of the first countries in the world to be target of the so-called hybrid warfare. And the attack was somehow a turning point for your country. 12 years later, Estonia is one of the most digitalized countries in the world, and Estonia is a sort of country brand today, and it's a benchmark in cybersecurity. So could you tell us what happened and how the cyber attack transformed your country and the foreign policy of your country?
What happened in 2007 was actually quite interesting textbook case what can happen, yes, when we are talking about the new conflicts and hybrid campaigns, because in 2007, Estonia was already heavily digitalized country. Already since the beginning of 90s, Estonia has started to use off-the-shelf newest technology, and the digital services were available for both the private and the public sector services, and Estonians were reliant on online services in 2007. So that's why the cyber attacks were affecting the society, because society was relying on online services, and suddenly those services were not available. And if you ask what was the reason, so the reason was the history of the Second World War, because we had a monument in the middle of the city which was dedicated to the Red Army soldiers in the Second World War, and since the different groups in the society had different views again towards this monument, and Estonian-speaking population was uneasy with the different parties around the monument and demonstrations there, and the government had plans to relocate this to the military cemetery. And before the relocation, the excavations took place around the monument. And around that time, just when it was not located yet, there were fake news spread in the local Russian-speaking social media about the possible demolition of the monument. And then it spurred riots, and since the riots were getting out of hand, the government decided to relocate the monument the same night when the riots started. And then the monument has now been relocated for the past 12 years in the military cemetery. And nobody remembers anymore about the monument. But what everybody remembers is the cyberattacks, which happened after everything started. But it was a campaign that had many elements, and cyber was just one of the elements. There were physical elements of riots. There were elements of economic sanctions. There were many other elements. So I think this was a glimpse to the future and how the conflicts will be played out in the future. And we saw the same methods in many other countries later on that we could recognize from 2007. And I think this is now something that has become more understood in also many other parts of the world and also in the European countries. But the lesson learned from this was really that you have to build resilience at home. You have to be able to protect your systems when something happens, because in 2007, when Estonia was under the cyber siege for 3 weeks, what really happened was the very intensive mitigation by the local cyber security experts. They were local experts which were very professional, who knew what to do, who knew how to restore the services, and they were basically mitigating the cyber attacks 24/7 with some shifts, and this is how they managed the situation. So you have to have, in order to resist this kind of cyber siege, the locally experienced and locally available professionals. You have to be ready to know what is the most critical and to protect the most critical. And you also have to think about the reliance of your society on those services, because at some point, as a mitigation measure, Estonia cut itself out from the internet in order to have the online services for our banks to be able to serve Estonian people inside of the country. And since it was short time when Estonia was not visible from outside, so it has provided to the myth that we were cut off from the internet for 3 weeks, which was not true. Everybody who has looked at the facts, what happened in 2007, knows that for one bank it was 1 day and a half that online services were out, because it was the time of the worst attack. But then the online services were restored, and it was like a cat and mouse game all the time. The services were taken down, and then the security professionals in the country were restoring them. And at some point where the attacks became too intense, then there was a decision made to cut itself off from the internet, because we are in the receiving end of the global internet, we can do it. It's not easy and possible in larger countries when you have many connections. But I think many countries learned from this lesson, and many countries actually also diminished the number of the connections later on. So, but this is the last resort to mitigate.
Pero esta fue la última medida de mitigación. ¿Así?
It's kind of 3 weeks cyber campaign. Yes, we learned what to do and how to resolve these kind of situations in the future. And shortly after the cyber attacks in 2007, Estonia has created the first strategy on cybersecurity in the world that had very serious part there about international cooperation and the global response to cyber attacks. Because we have understood already then that when you are under the distributed of denial of service attack, which comes from around 70 jurisdictions in the world, then in order to block these attacks, you have to talk with these 70 jurisdictions in the world. And in some jurisdictions, you had contact points, and you could call a familiar person and ask to take some measures. But many of those jurisdictions, at that time in 2007, there was nobody to call, and there were no cybersecurity systems and measures in place on a national level. And the further you go away from Europe, the more you have these territories where nobody was in charge. I think now the situation is much better, but ever since, yes, Estonia has very purposefully started to push for international cooperation, international cyber policies of the NATO, European Union, agreements in the UN, agreements in the OSCE, and this has been always something that then became part of our foreign policy intrinsically, so, and is now as well.
Which countries are more vulnerable to this type of actions?
I think the countries with very high reliance on digital systems is quite vulnerable, but usually those countries that have very high reliance on digitalization are also better prepared for threats, because they are usually more resourced and can afford also better defense. So therefore, my guess would be that actually the countries that are most vulnerable would be the countries that are not maybe the most highly developed countries, but that have recently digitalized very rapidly, but maybe did not have time and resources to create proper safeguards and resilience systems. So therefore, I might think that this, of course, this is just my guess, and I don't have very hard data right now with me, but there are all different indexes around which countries are the best in cybersecurity, and then some rankings have been made on cybersecurity. But I think in the end, it really depends on what we are looking at. Sometimes the country is good on addressing cybercrime. Sometimes the country is good at having good cyber resilience system. Sometimes the private sector is very, very well prepared. Sometimes the government is more prepared. So I think we have to really look then in more detail how the countries are prepared. But as a rule, of course, we know from what we have seen globally is that the countries with less resources in the whole digital domain usually are also more vulnerable, so meaning developing nations.
You're ambassador at large for cyber diplomacy. So I would like to know what can diplomacy do to counteract to these problems arising from the digital era?
As I have explained in the beginning, I think we have to talk about responsible state behavior, and we discuss with all the UN countries in the UN formats how to respond to, or how to behave properly and how to hold up international law. But what else can we do? Because there are countries that are not really following those norms and laws. We can also produce the response to irresponsible behavior. And I think the European Union has done quite useful work in this regard. There is the EU Joint Diplomatic Framework to respond to malicious cyber activities, which was adopted in 2017. Earlier this year, in 2019, the European Union has adopted the cyber sanctions regime.
And a toolbox, the EU
yes,
toolbox too.
Yeah, and the sanctions regime is one of the horizontal regimes similar to maybe chemical weapons regime and the other horizontal regimes, which allows to European Union to respond to malicious cyber activities. And there are other ways how countries can call for better behavior. In 2018, Estonia joined the coordinated attribution on certain cases, which took place in cyberspace, like ransom cases, WannaCry and NotPetya, and attempted hack of the OPCW, the chemical weapons organization in The Hague, and also one of the intellectual property thefts called APT-10 threat. So there were 4 coordinated attribution cases in 2018 to also show that we do not tolerate the malicious behavior.
But I think that in this discussion there is a starting point, which is if it's possible to regulate the cyberspace and who is doing it and how to do it.
Regulating the cyberspace, I think we have heard that quite often, and usually we are then thinking what part of cyberspace or what aspect of cyberspace we regulate here, because cyberspace in a way is like a weather. It's everywhere, and or climate. So how can we regulate the climate, or how can we regulate the weather? So I think we have to also look at the specific part. So I just talked about state behavior, and we regulate this via the international law, which already exists, international humanitarian law, UN Charter, international human rights law, and so on. Then when we look at the technology weaknesses that we have in the software and hardware, then the governments can regulate it differently. They can set standards to the producers for better security measures in the software and hardware. And I think, again, European Union has progressed here. There is a plan to start to certify the products sold in the European Union according to the security labeling. So I think this is one of the ways how government can regulate.
But how international law applies to cyber attacks?
Yeah, that's a very good question. International law applies because there are principles in the international law. First, government should not attack critical infrastructure. Government should not use civilian critical infrastructure for attacking important objects. So there should be proportionality and all these principles when the cyber attacks are carried out. So there are 2 bodies of international law. One is jus ad bellum, or meaning how we are entering the war, and then jus in bello, how we do our conduct when we are already at war. So this latter, when we already have a war anyway, and then how we regulate the conduct when in war, is called international humanitarian law or law of armed conflict. How this will be applying in cyberspace is very well described in a long analysis called Tallinn Manual, which is one of the most authoritative legal texts that exist there on international law applying in cyberspace. So this is the jus in bello part, which is quite clear, and there is a good understanding how the government should act in cyberspace. The more difficult part is when there is not clear threshold of armed conflict happening and the cyber operations happen below the threshold. Threshold is there and cyber operation just happens just below the threshold. But peacetime is somewhere there. So the question is what happens in this gray zone when the cyber operations are carried out? It's not the really armed conflict yet because it doesn't meet the threshold, but it is quite disruptive and damaging for our economies and society. Let's take the malware attacks, WannaCry and NotPetya, that have caused very significant disruptions in some of the economic sectors in 2017. So what actually then we can observe is that the international customary law is also regulating state behavior below the threshold of armed conflict, and allowing the government that was subject of the cyber operation or cyber attack to take the countermeasures, to apply sanctions, to do the demarches and so on. So there are different possibilities how you can react, or you can do it individually, or you can also do it collectively. And this part of international law is still actually under the formation, because the international customary law is something that is forming according to the state behavior as it happens, or state practice. And it is quite important that many governments have recently articulated how they see international law applying in this customary law space. We have seen the French views, the Dutch views, the British views. Estonia has produced something there. And I think the more governments are coming out with this kind of analysis, how they see the states should apply international law, the clearer it comes what exactly international law can do. And one very important maybe notion to remember would be that the existing international law provides us enough basis for guidance in both during the armed conflict and below the threshold of armed conflict. So all the voices that are calling for new international law that would solve all the problems in cyberspace, these are not really realistic because any legal debate at this stage in the UN will take at least 50 years or so. And if we start even thinking about this avenue, it means that for the next 50 years, some countries might think the law is not applying at all. And this is possibly something we do not want to see. So we are, not just Estonia, but also other member states of the European Union of opinion that the existing international law should be applied in cyberspace first. And this is what we are working on.
And where do most threats come from? Which state, non-state actor, sponsor state actor?
Yeah, there are many non-state actors, but the non-state actors usually are creating more locally contained damage. I think the most serious campaigns that we have seen so far, I already mentioned WannaCry and NotPetya, have been attributed to the state actors, and these have been more disruptive and more widespread than the non-state actor originated cyber operations. So therefore, I think right now we are trying to regulate the state behavior and make sure that the disruptive activities, as we have seen from the recent cases from Russia, North Korea and China, are not going to be continued.
Is Russia interfering in European states?
I think it has been widely reported in terms of election meddling and elections in Europe that many countries have seen certain influences.
Is there today a country which we could call a super cyber power?
It's an interesting question, what constitutes cyber power. If you think it's offensive weapons or offensive capabilities, then it's one measurement. The other measurement might be that maybe some countries are very resilient, and maybe that's why they might be called also powerful, but they do not have this kind of capabilities. So I think it's very difficult to say what is cyber power. But since the conventional thinking about cyber power...
In terms of resilience or capability?
Exactly. You can have the dimension of resilience and dimension of... offensive. And cyber power consists of the mixture of both. Of course, when we look at the offensive, then we'll be largest countries in the world, and but on the resilience side, the picture is more interesting, of course. I think most of the European countries are good on the resilience side. So.
Mm-hmm. I would like to open the scope of infrastructures or physical security to talk about other challenges or risks to our societies, such as fake news, you have already mentioned, or misinformation, or how malicious use of the internet and the new technology is putting us at risk, our democracies?
Well, I think we just have been through the very interesting period of many national elections and European elections where all these fears were there, and many of those fears were also well addressed and well countered. And before the European Union parliamentary elections, the member states also shared best practices, and they put together a compendium on best practices of election security, and this was applied in most of the member states. So I think we have quickly learned from the weaknesses and vulnerabilities that are there in our systems, especially related to the election security. And what we also have learned that different European countries still have to find their own models how they do it, because there are no two similar systems on election infrastructure in European countries. It is still a very national project because elections are organized by each member state. So there is no pan-European aspect really. It's a pan-European aspect only can be that there is a facilitation of information sharing and so on. So the activities have to happen in every capital. And I think the European Union member states have come together quite well around this issue and really have taken it seriously and have also mitigated our worst fears, because we have not seen this kind of scenario materializing where some of the European elections had been influenced entirely by some foreign powers.
We are all seeing how difficult it's been to get an agreement on internet governance. So I think it's also very difficult to this kind of agreement of the cyberspace governance. But in your opinion, how should be the appropriate forum for the regulation of cyberspace? United Nations?
Again, I think we have to think what kind of part of the cyberspace we regulate here. There is no one cyberspace, but there is the infrastructure part of cyberspace. There is a state behavior part, and also the technology provider part.
Let's talk about, for example, state behavior.
State behavior. Yes, largely we need more global approach there, because this is the European states usually behave quite well, so we are not concerned about the European Union member states' behavior in cyberspace. And
but the United Nations.
This is the United Nations field to have the global agreement on what kind of cyber norms exist and how to implement them. But when it comes to resilience part, then European Union and all the regional organizations can do a lot to encourage their members to build better resilience and exchange best practices and to do the information sharing and so on. If it comes to question of technology providers or producers of software and hardware and so on, then we can also think about maybe the industry self-regulation before the heavy governmental regulation. Because if industry would come up with the standards for security and security by design, then maybe it will be more agreeable approach by then government coming and asking something that industry cannot comply with. So I think we also have to maybe enter the concept of thinking about smart regulation than when we are going to regulate the technology providers.
And in your experience, in your relation with diplomats all around the world, in your opinion, which countries are leading the transformation of foreign policy with this digital orientation?
There is a group of countries which is quite active in this field. I think all the English-speaking countries, of course, they really are active. In the European Union, of course, in addition to Estonia, that has been talking about digital and cyber now for many years, there are also countries that have taken the cyber diplomacy as an important field into the foreign policy, such as the Netherlands and Germany and France, and of course globally we have also our close allies, Japan, South Korea and Singapore, so there are many countries.
Well, I think we are open the floor for some questions, so I collect some of them. And please say your name and be as clear as possible. We have a question out there.
Hi. Well, we've seen that in at least in consumer tech that privacy is a huge issue, and I wonder if, from the cyber diplomacy view, is also an issue. Because at least what I know about cyber diplomacy is more about infrastructure, but considering that many of us use technology that is developed in countries like China or maybe even giving some personal data to servers that are located there, do you see that that information can somehow be weaponized against your citizens or whatever? So
I think you just have pointed out a very important new challenge that we have, yes, that we are increasingly concerned about the origin of technology in our critical infrastructures, yes. And the privacy is slowly and steadily entering also our debates and the human rights aspect of using technology. Yeah.
I think there is another question over there.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you, Ambassador, for speaking here in front of all of us. And I would like to point out an important problem that I think we have nowadays after you speak. That is I don't think that right now we have any developed system to link non-state actors with state actors. This means that since non-state actors are not bound by using VELO or international humanitarian law, are there any things that we could do to link actions carried out by non-state actors with state actors that may have hired them?
The short answer would be, it is possible to link them if there is the necessity to do it, because as I mentioned, we attributed the very important ransomware cases to state actors. It took time and resources, but eventually it happened. So it is a bit time consuming still, but it is possible if there is a link. Yeah.
There's another question over there.
Yes, good afternoon. Luis Orlandi. I was just wondering about the human resources of the cyberdiplomacy and what are the skills that will be required for facing new challenges in the diplomacy world, and what are the boundaries for the diplomats talking about this topic? Thank you.
Yeah, that is also a very good question, because recognizing the need for more training and knowledge creation in this field, Estonia has started a tradition of cyber diplomacy summer school. We organized this summer a week-long training for the diplomats from EU, NATO, and like-minded countries, where we went through the topics of state behavior, international law, internet governance, and policies of major international organizations on cyber. And this already has proved very useful in our UN discussions that have started in this September. And I think there is also this kind of requirement to do more trainings globally. So it is a new field where we also have to take care of making sure that there is training available for those new diplomats that are entering this business, because many countries now are including this dimension to the foreign policy and are looking for training opportunities.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for your conference. You mentioned physical security and the infrastructure behind it. What should, and that European states should find their own model. Obviously, with foreign states providing that infrastructure, especially with 5G, I'm thinking of Huawei, what role should, or how should European countries go about their cyber diplomacy when their physical infrastructure is provided by another country?
There is a debate right now in the European Union about the 5G risks, and the European Commission just came up with a recommendation, as you might know, a few weeks ago, which is very seriously calling all the capitals to consider the 5G related risks. And I think all the capitals have to make that decision themselves. As for Estonia, we are going to mitigate this risk. We will have the risk management process for 5G. And we are going to consider all these aspects of privacy, data protection, and human rights, and the more political risk management there.
No more questions? Oh. Over there, sorry.
Me. Okay. Thank you for your presentation. So you have talked about cyber attack as a new way to start the conflict between countries or institutions. So my question is, at what extent is it possible to identify the source of a cyber attack? I guess that it is one of the main features of this hostility. So is it always possible to identify who is behind the cyber attack?
Short answer, yes, eventually it is, but it might take time before you get into the source. And the second part of the answer, what I wanted to tell you is that actually the cyber itself is not going to start any new conflict. The conflict still starts because of some geopolitical or more strategic or some other issue. But cyber will be just used as a domain and as a tool to aid the goals in the conflict. So the cyber attacks will not fall down from the sky. They also always have some more political reason. So it's unless you have a very bad cyber attack that is misattributed, and then there is an escalation. And that's why we have to be very careful with the attribution. That attribution is done properly and carefully, and it is time consuming, yes.
No? Okay. So I don't know if there is more questions. I have another question. Is the European Union well fitted to face cyber attack? Or
the European Union as a whole consists of member states, and I think there are member states which are very resilient in the European Union already. Of course, I think there is also different levels of maturity amongst the member states, and as the central bureaucracy in Brussels, the European Union has been encouraging the member states to build resilience on a national level, because cyber is a bit like firefighting. You have to have the fire brigade at home. Nobody from Brussels or anywhere else is going to put up your fire here in Madrid or there in Tallinn. You have to have those specialists at home. As I described the Cyberattacks in Tallinn or in Estonia in 2007, we had our professionals at home, and nobody else was there to help, because you cannot help from outside, because you only know your own system. It's a bit like if you defend your castle, you have to defend the castle that you know. If somebody else is coming from outside, they don't know your castle. They don't know what kind of hallways and what kind of catacombs and what kind of staircases are there. So this kind of logic is difficult to understand sometimes, but I think this is the easiest way to explain how to do it. And that's why the resilience and preparedness against cyber attacks in the European Union depends on the national cyber resilience. And what the European Union has been doing in order to encourage the national cyber resilience is to ask the member states to do more. And there has been a number of directives or regulatory initiatives on behalf of the European Commission. Most maybe significantly the directive on network and information system security, the famous NIS directive. Also the directive on attacks against information systems that has harmonized this fight with cybercrime in the European Union, and many others. So there are ways to encourage the member states, but eventually all the member states have to do their homework here.
Mm-hmm. So I think that if there is another one. Slowly dropping.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. And I just want to ask you, we were talking all the time about the countries and all the cyber diplomacy, but in the whole national level. My question is about the citizen. I mean, when we are taking like other question that you have about how conscious is the country about their vulnerability about this, you have some data about how citizens are conscious about these cyber attacks, and if in case this can influence how the country can instaurate new programs about make the people conscious about it. I don't know if it makes sense.
Yeah, I think you are talking about awareness raising about cyber threats. Yes, it is possible to raise awareness amongst the citizens on the possibility of all sorts of different cyber threats. Usually, the cyber threats against the citizen would be more of a criminal nature. Somebody wants to steal your credit card number, or somebody wants to steal your identity in internet, or somebody takes over your Gmail account or so on. But these are the usual vectors against the citizens. But I think also for instance, I remember the last Estonian national poll was still ranking the possibility of a cyber attack against the entire country as a very serious threat. So, what else is new, right? But still, this is showing that there is a high level of awareness on cyber threats. The governments can teach their own citizens, and there are special awareness raising programs, I think, in many countries in Europe. And I think October actually is awareness raising month on cybersecurity. And I remember when I was working in the European Union, then we made many events in Brussels in October, which is now. So maybe your colleague from Spanish Prime Minister office wants to comment on cybersecurity awareness raising in Spain, but I don't know. So after the session, I can pinpoint you somebody who knows the answer, how it's happening in Spain.
Would you like to share with us your... Okay. So thank you very much, everyone, for your questions, from being here. Thank you, Ambassador. It's been a pleasure. It's been a very interesting session.
Thank you for inviting me.
Right, and thanks Fundación Telefónica as well, and Aspen Institute.
Okay.